This brief lecture is going to be an introduction to lactic acidosis. It's having a physiological concept that you can use bedside whenever you run into a lactic acidosis scenario. If one has to summarize, it is all about the ATP. And you look at this gentleman nicely having a great view of the pastures and the mountains. We all forget about how hard he must have worked to get up there. To climb that mountain, he's going to need a lot of ATP. His muscles would need a lot of. How do we make ATP? You need a fuel. Here we're using glucose that's going through glycolysis, and then product is pyruvate. You make 2 ATP here, and then the pyruvate needs to be converted to acetyl-CoA before it can enter citric acid cycle, and you will make NADH, a citric acid cycle that goes through oxidative phosphorylation. And the key here is oxygen. You need oxygen for oxidative phosphorylation to happen, and you generate a ton of ATP. You generate 34 more ATP in addition to these two, so you get up to 36 ATP per glucose molecule if you have oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, you're going to be stuck with anaerobic glycolysis. That means all you're going to do is get the part from the glycolysis and the rest cannot progress. So all this mitochondrial part cannot progress because you need oxygen. Since 2 ATP is better than 0, you will keep on going through glycolysis and the pyruvates get shunted to lactate. So anytime you are seeing an elevated lactate, pyruvate is being shunted to lactate. It's going to switch over to anaerobic because there's not enough oxygen. That's when you generate lactate. Okay, let's go back to the picture. Let's imagine a small muscle cell here. It needs to generate the maximum amount of ATP so that it can climb that mountain. We don't generate oxygen. The oxygen is all here, and it has to reach the cell for it to use that oxygen and generate the ATP so that it can climb the mountain. From here down to here. Tissue, that's a so the oxygen demand is determined by how fast you are going to climb, and you'll be consuming that oxygen, and you should have a delivery mechanism to get that oxygen in broad. It starts off by taking a breath, you load your lungs with oxygen, and then you transfer that oxygen onto your carriages, which is hemoglobin. You fill it up. Now you got to drive these carriages around the body. Overview, and that's where you get the engine that's going to be your cardiac output. And cardiac output, as we know, is heart rate times stroke volume. So if you have a situation where there is an increased demand in the tissues, the train has to go faster. So the cardiac output has to increase, and these carriages will be driven faster. Of why lactate generation happens. It all boils down to you don't have. So while you're at rest, normally you end up with 100% saturation. In tissues, you usually empty one carriage. You return at 75% and get loaded and drive again. If the tissue demand as he's climbing the mountain increases, this cardiac output, this engine, has to run faster. That means it'll make faster trips so that it can meet the tissue demand. If you cannot meet the demand, enough oxygen delivery. In the next talk, we will talk about individual examples of various scenarios where you can see lactic acidosis. The only request I have is please do not equate an elevated lactate to sepsis. Sepsis can raise your lactic, but it is not the only reason, and it is almost an insult to human physiology if we simplify it to elevated lactate equals sepsis in clinical practice. Please don't do that. And I'll follow up with the next video where we'll talk about different scenarios and how to think about lactic acidosis in a clinical setting.